the unexpected arrival. The small courtroom in Jackson County was far from grand, more akin to a cozy town hall meeting than the kind of place where decisions were made that affected the course of people's lives. The benches were hard, the air thick with the musty scent of old wood and the faint hum of the ceiling fan that struggled to keep the space cool. The usual sound of murmuring voices echoed as locals settled into their seats, some glancing over papers, others engaged in quiet conversations. It was just another mundane day for the citizens of this sleepy Wyoming town. That is, until the gavel came down with a sharp crack. Judge Robert Willis, a man of average height and considerable girth, adjusted his glasses, squinting at the paperwork laid out before him. He had been a judge for over 2 decades, and cases like this one, simple zoning disputes, were nothing new to him. He knew exactly how this was going to go. The county had issued a violation notice for the defendant's guest house, claiming it exceeded the size restrictions set by local zoning laws. The solution was straightforward: the house would either be torn down or altered to comply with the guidelines. No big deal. Mr. Eastwood, the judge began, his voice carrying across the room as he looked up from the papers, it says here that your guest house on the northern edge of your property exceeds the size limitation set forth by Jackson County zoning laws. As such, the county is within its rights to require that it be brought into compliance or removed. I assume you'd like to make a case for keeping it? The mention of the defendant's name caused a slight stir in the room. Clint Eastwood. The name itself was enough to make heads turn. Many of those present had likely seen at least one of his movies, and some, especially the older generation, were well aware of his many iconic roles as a tough guy hero or no-nonsense lawman. And yet, here he was, sitting at a small, cluttered table in front of a judge in a tiny Wyoming courthouse. Eastwood sat quietly, his worn leather jacket creased at the shoulders, his blue eyes unwavering. He was no stranger to public attention, but today, the attention wasn't on his films or his fame. It was focused squarely on the situation before him, a situation that many would have handled differently, perhaps with a bit more showmanship. But not Eastwood. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the wooden table in front of him, and spoke in a low, gravelly voice that still carried through the room effortlessly. I built that place with my own hands, he said, a note of quiet pride in his tone. It's not bothering anybody. And I sure as hell don't take kindly to the government telling me what I can and can't do on my own land. The crowd, which had been listening attentively, let out a few scattered chuckles. Some nodded in agreement, as if understanding the frustration of being told what to do with your property. But Judge Willis, who had heard every excuse under the sun during his years on the bench, wasn't swayed. He had his role to play, and he wasn't about to let a Hollywood actor sidestep the law. Mr. Eastwood, the judge said, clearing his throat as he glanced at the file before him. The law applies to everyone, even if you have a few movies under your belt. Laughter rippled through the room, and Eastwood, ever the professional, didn't even flinch. He remained calm, his gaze steady. It was almost as if he expected this reaction, and yet he didn't let it ruffle him. Eastwood had spent much of his life in the public eye, from his days as a young actor to his transformation into a director and producer. But now, at the age of 85, he wasn't here to play to an audience. This wasn't a movie set. This was real life. And in real life, Clint Eastwood wasn't just an actor, he was a man who had lived a life far more complex than the simple image of Hollywood fame. The laughter faded, and for a moment, there was nothing but the faint rustle of papers as the judge, perhaps underestimating the man before him, prepared to move on with the case. But Eastwood was not about to let the matter rest so easily. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket pocket, and the room quieted. The bailiff, standing at attention near the door, tensed. He took a half-step forward, his hand hovering just near the holster of his gun. It wasn't that Eastwood looked like a threat, it was simply the atmosphere of the moment that had shifted. Eastwood, for his part, paid no attention to the subtle shift in the room's energy. He didn't even look up from the table as he retrieved something from his jacket. He placed the object, a small, silver badge, flat on the wooden surface. It gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, its inscription catching the attention of everyone present. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago evaporated. The air felt denser now, charged with a kind of tension that had not been present before. Judge Willis narrowed his eyes, squinting at the badge. His lips parted as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" he muttered, his usual authority slipping slightly. Eastwood didn't respond immediately. He simply sat back, his arms crossing over his chest, watching the judge's reaction with quiet interest. "That, Your Honor," Eastwood said at last, his voice steady and calm, "is a United States Secret Service badge. And it means I've had to enforce a lot more than zoning laws in my time." The room fell dead silent. Judge Willis's face drained of color. His fingers twitched slightly, and he adjusted his glasses for a closer look at the badge. He wasn't a fool. He recognized the significance of what Eastwood had just revealed. Only those who had served in the most confidential, high-stakes corners of the federal government were ever issued such a badge. The kind of service Eastwood was implying was not something that could be dismissed easily. The tension in the room was now palpable, and the spectators, many of whom had once been amused by the idea of seeing a Hollywood star in a courtroom, were now on edge. They understood, in an instant, that something much larger was unfolding before them. The judge's voice trembled slightly as he finally found his words. "Mr. Eastwood, are you telling me you were more than just an actor?" Eastwood's eyes, still calm and collected, met the judge's with a quiet intensity. "I'm telling you that I've done things that the public will never know about. Things that, in some cases, kept people safe." There was a pause, a long, heavy moment where no one spoke. The weight of what Eastwood had just said hung in the air, thick with uncertainty. The judge, still stunned, shifted in his chair, his eyes flicking to the bailiff who was clearly as lost as he was. The murmurs from the gallery had ceased entirely. "What does this mean?" Judge Willis asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eastwood, as always, seemed unruffled by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "It means that sometimes, what appears to be a simple zoning issue is anything but. This isn't about a guest house. It's about a lot more than that. And I can't say more right now." For a moment, no one moved. The room was frozen in time, everyone unsure of what to do or say. It was as though the simple act of Eastwood placing that badge on the table had somehow turned the entire world upside down. What had begun as a routine case had just become a moment in history, a moment that no one in that courtroom would ever forget. And then, in his usual unhurried fashion, Eastwood leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for the judge to process the reality of what he had just learned. He had no intention of explaining further. The story would unfold on its own, in its own time. "I've made my case," Eastwood said quietly. "Now, it's up to you, Your Honor." The judge stared at him for a moment longer before finally nodding slowly, the weight of the situation sinking in. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge finally spoke, his voice more subdued than before, "what exactly are you doing here in Wyoming?" Eastwood's lips curled into a faint, inscrutable smile. "Just trying to live a quiet life," he said. "Just like everyone else." And with that, the room fell into a new kind of silence, the kind that accompanies the realization that nothing, absolutely nothing, was what it seemed. Secrets unveiled. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs and light-hearted laughter, was now a hushed void of silence. Every person in the room had been struck by the same overwhelming thought: they were no longer just sitting in the presence of Clint Eastwood, the actor. They were sitting before someone who had lived a life shrouded in mystery, in the very corridors of power that most would never even dare to enter. Judge Robert Willis leaned back in his chair, his glasses perched precariously on his nose as he stared at the small silver badge that now lay on the table. The once routine zoning case had taken a sharp and unexpected turn into uncharted territory. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but the overwhelming one that remained was, what kind of man was Clint Eastwood, really? Eastwood sat back, his hands now folded across his chest, his calm demeanor unwavering. The sharp lines of his face, weathered by age, told stories that no one here could fully comprehend. His blue eyes, however, remained as piercing as ever, as if he were not just here in this courtroom, but watching something much bigger unfold, something only he knew. Mr. Eastwood, Judge Willis finally managed to speak, his voice soft, almost reverential. Are you telling me you were part of the United States Secret Service? That's not something I expected to hear today. Eastwood's eyes met the judge's without a hint of hesitation. I'm not here to talk about my past service, Your Honor. But what I can tell you is that the badge I showed you is more than just a trinket. It's a reminder of the things I've been part of. The things I've seen. Things that, at times, you'd rather forget. The weight of Eastwood's words settled over the room like a thick fog. The idea that Clint Eastwood, a man who had commanded the screen in his countless roles, had also operated in the shadows of national security was a revelation no one could have anticipated. The judge's mind raced, torn between disbelief and a deep sense of awe. He was a man of the law, sworn to uphold justice, yet he couldn't help but feel that the very laws he had sworn to enforce might not apply here, not in the way they did for everyone else. The Secret Service was a world apart, far beyond the small-town disputes he usually presided over. And what exactly does that mean for this case? Judge Willis asked, the lines of his face tightening. Are you trying to tell me that this zoning issue, this guest house dispute, is somehow connected to your work with the Secret Service? Eastwood let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh, his gaze unwavering. Not directly, Your Honor. But the people involved in this case, and the forces at play here in Jackson County, well, they aren't as innocent as they may appear. The room shifted again. People began to shift in their seats, leaning forward slightly, their curiosity piqued. The mundane zoning dispute had now become something far greater. What had started as an innocent visit to a small town was slowly unraveling into something much larger, much more dangerous. Are you suggesting? The judge started, trailing off as he struggled to put the words together. Are you suggesting that this case has something to do with national security? Eastwood's eyes softened for just a moment. No, Your Honor, he said quietly. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that sometimes things aren't always as they seem. People think they're safe. They think they're just dealing with a simple zoning issue. But the truth is, the world is never as simple as we want to believe. There are forces at work, forces that control much more than just a guest house. Judge Willis felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the way Eastwood spoke, so calmly, so matter-of-fact, that made his words seem all the more unsettling. The more the judge thought about it, the more he realized just how little he truly knew about the man sitting in front of him. Clint Eastwood wasn't just the aging star of spaghetti westerns and gritty crime thrillers. He was a man who had likely seen the darkest corners of the world and had emerged from them unscathed. The judge cleared his throat again, his voice gaining a measure of control. You're saying there's a connection between the people here in Jackson County and something bigger? Something dangerous? Eastwood leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the judge's. Yes. And that's why I'm here. I've been living a quiet life for years, Your Honor, but sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. It comes calling when you least expect it. And when it does, you don't get to choose whether you answer the call or not. You have to deal with it. The judge swallowed, his mind racing to keep up with Eastwood's words. And what do you expect me to do with this information? What can I possibly do with a story like that? Eastwood paused for a moment, the faintest glimmer of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. I'm not asking you to do anything, Your Honor. But I think it's time someone took a closer look at the people pulling the strings behind this case. It's not just about a guest house anymore. There's more going on here, and you can't ignore it. For a moment, Judge Willis didn't know how to respond. The absurdity of it all, sitting in a courtroom in the middle of Wyoming, hearing Clint Eastwood of all people speak about national security conspiracies, seemed like something straight out of one of Eastwood's own movies. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. And Eastwood was real. Are you telling me that you think someone in this town is involved in something illegal? Something that could endanger national security? The judge asked, incredulous. Eastwood shook his head slowly. Not necessarily. But sometimes, small towns like this one are the perfect place for certain things to happen. Things that go unnoticed, things that no one would suspect. The key is to look at who benefits from keeping people in the dark. The judge's mind was spinning. This wasn't just about a zoning dispute anymore. This was about something much bigger. Something that could affect not just the people of Jackson County, but possibly the country itself. The realization hit him like a cold slap in the face. For all his years on the bench, for all the cases he had presided over, he had never once imagined he would be faced with something like this. I think, Judge Willis said, his voice firming up, that I need to know more, Mr. Eastwood. I need to understand exactly what you're implying. And I need to know if what you're saying is true. Eastwood leaned back, his expression unreadable. I'm not asking you to believe me, Your Honor. I'm asking you to keep your eyes open. Because when the truth comes out, it'll be too late to do anything about it. The weight of Eastwood's words settled heavily over the judge, his mind racing with questions. But one thing was clear, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a man who had come to Wyoming to defend a guest house. He was here for something much more significant, something that could have far-reaching consequences. I'll look into it, Judge Willis said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined. I will need more than just your word, Mr. Eastwood. I need facts. Eastwood nodded, his gaze never wavering. You'll have them. Soon enough. As Eastwood stood to leave, the courtroom remained frozen in a moment of stunned silence. No one moved, not even the bailiff. Judge Willis watched as Eastwood walked out of the courtroom, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The judge remained seated, his mind overwhelmed with the enormity of what he had just heard. The small town of Jackson County, Wyoming, was no longer just the backdrop to a simple zoning dispute. It was now the setting for a mystery that reached far beyond the boundaries of this courtroom, and perhaps even beyond the boundaries of this country. And somewhere, out there in the dark corners of the world, Clint Eastwood's past was catching up with him, and everyone else. The storm was coming. And no one in that courtroom knew just how much it would change their lives. The tension builds. The courtroom door clicked shut behind Clint Eastwood, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to settle like dust in the air. Judge Robert Willis sat in his chair, his eyes still locked on the space where the legendary actor had just stood. The heavy, oppressive weight of what had been revealed seemed to press down on his chest. It wasn't just the truth about Eastwood's past that had stunned him, it was the implication that everything around him might not be as it seemed. For a few long moments, the judge didn't move. The crowd, once a murmuring collection of curious onlookers, had now become statues, frozen in place by the gravity of the situation. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves were closing in, pressing every person inside into a shared sense of anxiety and confusion. Finally, Judge Willis broke the silence with a heavy sigh. Well, that's not something you hear every day, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck as he leaned forward, elbows on the table. He glanced at the papers in front of him, but they no longer held any meaning. What had started as a simple zoning issue had turned into something far more complicated, something that reached far beyond the borders of Jackson County. But the more the judge thought about it, the more he realized just how little he truly knew about Eastwood, about the case, and even about the people in his own town. Mr. Eastwood, the judge said, shaking his head in disbelief. What is it that you're trying to tell me, really? He leaned back, his eyes flicking to the small silver badge still sitting on the table. He picked it up carefully, as though it might burn his fingers if he touched it too roughly. The glint of the badge seemed to mock him now, a symbol of an unknown world that Judge Willis had never been a part of, yet now found himself embroiled in. The bailiff, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward cautiously. His face mirrored the judge's, confused, unsettled. "What now, Your Honor?" he asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Judge Willis stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the courthouse lawn. The familiar view didn't comfort him as it once did. The sky was overcast, and the wind seemed to be picking up, kicking dust across the pavement. It was a sign, he thought, a sign that everything was about to change. "I don't know yet," the judge said, his voice heavy with doubt. "But something doesn't sit right with me. There's more going on here, and I'm going to find out what it is." Clint Eastwood's departure from the courtroom wasn't just the end of his case, it was the beginning of something much more dangerous. In the weeks following the zoning dispute, rumors began to swirl in Jackson County. People talked about the actor, sure, but more than that, they talked about his mysterious past. What was this man really doing here? Was he truly who he said he was? Was he a retired agent of the Secret Service, or was he something more? Something darker? But Eastwood was no longer around to answer those questions. He had vanished almost as soon as the trial ended, his presence in the town as fleeting as a shadow. The judge's office was bombarded with inquiries from reporters and curious locals. The county had never seen anything like it. Local news channels picked up the story, fueling the fire. The media speculated wildly, painting Eastwood's visit as part of some larger, nefarious scheme. But in the weeks that followed, more troubling developments began to unfold. Judge Willis received an anonymous letter. It was a single sheet of paper, typed in a clean, professional font. The message was brief, almost too concise for its own good. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into. Look deeper. The people behind this case are not who they appear to be. You are being watched." At first, the judge dismissed it as the work of a prankster, someone trying to stir the pot. But the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. This wasn't a simple zoning dispute. This wasn't about the guest house. This was about something much larger, something sinister. Meanwhile, a few miles outside of Jackson County, Eastwood had gone underground. He was back on his property, the same one where he had built the guest house, but there were no signs of him anywhere on the property. The house stood in silence, as though it, too, had become a ghost of its former self. No reporters, no fans, not even a glimpse of his face. The only indication that Eastwood had been there at all was a solitary figure who would appear in the small town occasionally, his face always hidden by a hat or sunglasses. But Eastwood was still watching. He was still listening. And he was still planning. He had known, of course, that the visit to Jackson County would stir up more than just curiosity. He had expected it. But what he hadn't expected was how quickly the case would escalate, how deeply it would tap into the undercurrent of something far more dangerous than the townsfolk could have imagined. The moment he revealed his badge, he had set into motion a chain of events that would expose secrets that people in power had fought to keep hidden for years. The town was merely a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The connections went back decades, and they spanned much farther than this sleepy little corner of Wyoming. He had seen the signs before, the signals that certain things were about to unfold. But even Eastwood knew that once the pieces started to move, they couldn't be stopped. Back in the courtroom, Judge Willis continued to try and make sense of everything. It wasn't just the letter that was troubling him, it was the people around him. He started noticing things he hadn't before. Small, seemingly insignificant details that, in hindsight, felt like clues. The way some of the local officials avoided eye contact when he spoke to them about the case. The way certain people in the town had suddenly disappeared after Eastwood's visit. People who had been part of the zoning process but were no longer returning calls or responding to inquiries. Then came the most disturbing revelation of all, a phone call, late one evening, from a number he didn't recognize. Judge Willis, the voice on the other end of the line said, its tone cool and measured. "You've been asking too many questions. It's time to stop." The judge's blood ran cold. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the line went dead before he could say a word. He sat there in his office for a long time, staring at the phone in his hand. The case had gone from a simple zoning dispute to a tangled web of lies, secrecy, and fear. The more he looked into it, the more it felt like he was uncovering a story he wasn't supposed to know. And the more he learned, the more danger he realized he was in. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't back out. But neither could Eastwood. And the two of them, it seemed, were now locked in a race to uncover the truth before it was buried forever. In the days that followed, things began to escalate. Judge Willis's curiosity pushed him further than he ever intended. He started to connect dots that weren't meant to be connected. He uncovered old records from the county, documents that had long been forgotten. He learned of certain political figures who had mysteriously disappeared from public view after the guest house case had been mentioned. And in every corner, he found traces of something bigger than him, something he couldn't ignore. Eastwood, too, was closing in on the truth. From his remote cabin, he had begun to piece together what he had long suspected. There were people, powerful people, who had been manipulating events from behind the scenes. Jackson County had been a mere stepping stone, a small pawn in a much larger game. A game of shadows, of control, and of power. He knew that it wouldn't be long before the storm broke. And when it did, there would be no turning back. The tension continued to build, each new discovery adding fuel to the fire. Everyone involved, Eastwood, the judge, the townsfolk, was now trapped in a race against time. They were all pieces in a game they hadn't even known they were playing. But the time for secrets was running out. And when the storm finally came, it would change everything. The calm before the storm. Jackson County, Wyoming, had never known the kind of tension that was building in the shadows. The sleepy town, with its quiet streets and close-knit community, was about to be thrust into the kind of storm that had the potential to unravel the very fabric of its existence. It was no longer just a matter of a zoning dispute or an old Hollywood actor trying to keep his guest house. This was something far bigger, something that connected the small town to a network of power and influence that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Judge Robert Willis sat in his office late one night, the only sound in the room the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Every decision he had made up until this point, every case he had ruled on, now seemed like part of a much larger design, one that he hadn't seen coming, one that he wasn't prepared for. He had tried to ignore the creeping suspicion that had been growing in him ever since Clint Eastwood had revealed his true identity. The more he had looked into the case, the more he had uncovered. But the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. The phone call, the anonymous letters, the strange disappearances, each clue seemed to pull him further into a web that had been spun long before he had arrived in Jackson County. And now, as he sat alone in his office, the realization hit him: this was no longer just about a guest house or zoning laws. This was about something much darker, something that had been hidden from the public eye for far too long. The system that had governed this town, and possibly the entire country, had been manipulated by forces beyond his comprehension. The people who had held the reins of power in Jackson County for decades were now revealed to be part of a larger scheme that had touched every corner of the nation. Judge Willis had spent most of his career enforcing the law, believing in the idea of justice, of right and wrong. But what if the law itself had been twisted? What if the people he had trusted, the officials, the leaders, had all been complicit in something far more sinister? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He glanced up, startled, as the door creaked open. A familiar face appeared in the doorway, Deputy Sam Carter, a loyal officer who had been with the county for years. Sam's expression was tense, his face grim. "Your Honor," Sam said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "There's something you need to see." Judge Willis raised an eyebrow. What is it, Carter? Sam hesitated, glancing around the room as if checking for anyone who might be listening. It's about the town. About everything that's been happening. I've uncovered something. The judge stood up, his heart racing. What have you found? Without a word, Sam pulled a folder from under his arm and placed it on the judge's desk. He opened it, revealing a series of photographs, documents, and files, things that Judge Willis had never seen before. As he flipped through the papers, his eyes widened in disbelief. These are records from the zoning office, Sam said, his voice low. But it's not just about zoning. These records go back years, decades, even. And they show connections between the zoning board and people who shouldn't be involved in local affairs. Real estate developers, corporate entities, even politicians. The kind of people who pull strings from behind the scenes. The judge's mind spun as he processed the information. The documents were filled with names and dates, but the connections were more than just coincidental. The very people who had been pushing for zoning changes, for regulations that benefited the wealthy and the powerful, were the same people who had been manipulating the town's development for years. It was all connected, every zoning dispute, every development project, every so-called routine decision. Sam continued, his voice tight with urgency. I didn't want to believe it at first. But the more I dug, the more it became clear. They've been controlling everything from behind the scenes, moving pieces like chess players. And it's not just about Jackson County. This goes all the way up the chain. State officials, corporate interests, even people in Washington. The whole thing's a setup. And Eastwood wasn't just some actor. He's been trying to stop it. The weight of Sam's words hit the judge like a hammer. He had known that something wasn't right, but he had never imagined it could be this big. This wasn't just about a few bad actors in a small town, it was a conspiracy that reached across the entire country. And Clint Eastwood, the man he had thought was simply a retired actor, had been right in the middle of it, trying to expose the truth. The judge's hands trembled as he looked at the documents in front of him. This was the moment where everything changed. There was no going back now. He had to make a choice, ignore the truth and let the system continue to operate in the shadows, or stand up and fight, knowing full well that doing so could cost him everything. This is big, Sam, the judge said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bigger than anything I could have imagined. But I need to know, how much of this is real? How much of it can we prove? Sam's eyes darkened. That's the problem, Your Honor. We don't have enough to make it public yet. But if we don't act soon, everything will be buried. And the people responsible will walk away, like they always do. We're running out of time. Judge Willis closed the folder and stood up, pacing the room as he processed the gravity of the situation. The entire town, his entire career, had been built on a foundation of lies. The people he had trusted, the ones who had whispered in his ear and fed him information over the years, had been part of a much larger scheme, a scheme designed to keep the people in power at the top and everyone else in the dark. And Eastwood? The judge asked, turning back to Sam. What does he have to do with all this? Sam shook his head. He's been trying to expose it, to bring it all to light. He knew this was happening before any of us did. But they've been watching him, Your Honor. Watching him for years. And when he came to Jackson County, they knew he was getting too close. That's why they've tried to keep him quiet. The realization hit the judge like a thunderclap. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an actor caught in the middle of a zoning dispute, he was a whistleblower, a man who had seen the corruption and manipulation at play and was doing everything in his power to bring it down. The guest house wasn't just a building, it was a symbol. A symbol of resistance. And now, Judge Willis was part of it. He could no longer sit on the sidelines. He had to choose, stand by and watch as the world continued to be controlled by the few, or stand up and fight for the truth, no matter the cost. I need to talk to him, the judge said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't let this go any further. It's time to expose everything." Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood had not been idle. While the judge was uncovering the depths of the conspiracy, Eastwood was making his own moves. He knew that if he was going to take down the shadowy forces controlling Jackson County, he would need help. Real help. People who had the resources and the power to back him up. In the days after his brief appearance in court, Eastwood had reached out to several trusted allies, former colleagues, people who had been part of his world in the Secret Service. He had already known that Jackson County wasn't just a place where a zoning dispute happened. It was a microcosm of a much larger game being played. But now he needed to connect the dots, bring the pieces together, and expose the puppeteers who had been pulling the strings for so long. As Eastwood sat in his quiet cabin, he received a call from one of his old contacts, someone who could provide the last piece of the puzzle. "It's time," Eastwood said into the phone. "We've got to take them down before they finish what they started." With the clock ticking, the stage was set. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The calm before the storm was over. Now, it was time for the storm to break. The truth would be revealed. And with it, the power of those who had hidden in the shadows for so long would be exposed for all to see. Eastwood and Judge Willis were on a collision course with fate. What they didn't know was that they weren't the only ones who had been watching. The storm was coming, and no one would be left untouched.